opportunity to think about Delacroix. And I think that some of the issues that I'm going to be talking about today are a little bit different maybe from what we've been talking about during most of the symposium, but what I've tried to do is gather many of the points made throughout the symposium and kind of pull them all together into a commentary on the idea of the imagination. And the imagination is something that we talk about quite a bit when we talk about Delacroix and the Romantics. You know, we say the Romantics, you're teaching the survey, I'm teaching the survey right now. You say the Romantics, you know, primacy of the imagination. And I just wanted to think about what really is the imagination to the Romantics and to Delacroix. What does it mean when he talks about the imagination? And also, how does the idea of the imagination change over time, particularly from the 18th century to the 19th century? And I can't wait to hear in the gallery what ideas you guys have about the imagination and what it means to the Romantics and to Delacroix. But just to start out with a kind of a definition that I think applies to much of the Romantic period for the imagination is as the active life of the mind, an activity, an existence that is parallel to real life, but which gathers much of its material in the form of images from life as it's lived. And the imagination is the place, and often Romantic authors would speak of the imagination as if it were a dark room in which light images appeared. And I was sorry actually that the Mary Magdalene wasn't here because I think that that's in many ways a really wonderful visual image of what people imagined the imagination looked like, was as a dark space in which there is a figure that is becoming present, that is presenting itself sort of very fleetingly. There's also this character of fleetingness, presenting itself to the viewer. So the imagination is the place or the space where the images suggested by life can be reformed and manipulated according to desire. And Delacroix wrote about this quite a bit in his journal, but it was the idea that the image, once it's inside the imagination, can be kind of touched or changed the way a painter changes something when he puts it on the canvas. And in this way, the Romantic concept of the imagination was actually fairly close to the 18th century concept of the imagination as it was described in the Encyclopédie. And the Enlightenment concept of the imagination relied heavily upon memory and souvenir. So the imagination for an author like Diderot was served by memory and memory's capacity to remember images. And one category of image that the Encyclopédie talks about that is slightly different from memory is a category of image that is referred to as the souvenir. And the souvenir is a category of memory image that is inflected by emotional desire. So it's sort of, even in the age of reason, the Enlightenment, there was, of course, already a certain sense in which the memory was more likely, imagination was more likely to remember images that were related to some kind of affective or emotional charge. And I think certainly for Delacroix, the way that the memory focuses upon images that have a certain emotional, sensual, erotic charge is very important. In the journal, and I have been talking about the journal with different people, and of course, you know, Delacroix contradicts himself quite a bit in the journal. He doesn't always say the same thing, so it's easy to just kind of pick passages and say, this is what Delacroix thought, but it was only maybe what he thought for a few minutes. But anyway, he does present some interesting ideas, and in one case, he presents himself as the passive spectator of a rapid-fire image assault. And I'm going to quote, "At each instant, excellent ideas come to me, and instead of executing them at the moment in which they are clad with the charm lent to them by the imagination, I promise myself to execute them later. So there was this idea that he's expressing there that he was almost a spectator to the activity of his own imagination. His imagination was offering up all these images to him that could have come from paintings that he'd seen, from things he'd seen in the street, from all kinds of repertoire of visual knowledge. And it's coming to him, and he always expresses frustration. And this is the first time of many that I'm going to mention frustration. But he expresses frustration with the ability to capture these images. And to refer to Marc's talk yesterday about Rousseau and Lecoq, the idea of the imagination as something that ultimately is very frustrating or can create a great deal of frustration, because the imagination offers a kind of ideal that the aspiration towards which and the dejection that we feel when we don't reach the thing that we aspire towards inevitably kind of creates a sort of depressed society. So that's one way that imagination has come up in our symposium so far. And I think that indeed this was the case for Delacroix, thinking about the imagination, and he would struggle throughout his career to create images that were both true to his own imagination, so true to the things that he had seen in his mind, and that yet would also inspire other people to imaginative acts, so that people who saw Delacroix's own images, it wouldn't be the end of it. Seeing the painting was not the end of the experience. The experience would continue long after the original vision of the work, and it would continue in the imagination. So the image that came from the imagination would then affect the imagination of those who saw it. And to also refer to Nina's great lecture yesterday, I was struck by the idea not only that Delacroix wanted viewers to complete the work in their imagination, but also that the work, when it entered the imagination, had the character of a sketch. So we always talk about the way that Delacroix, to finish his painting, was to ruin his painting. But ultimately, to go from the sketch to the finished painting, the idea was that the viewer would then internalize that painting with the character of a sketch. And I think that's really interesting so it's this kind of, it goes back and forth. It's constantly shifting from the sketch into the painting, back into the viewer's own sketch-like perception of the work. And I think what this gets to in Delacroix was that there was something innately dissatisfying about the material fixedness of paint and painting. And this brings me to one quote, and I do have citations for these. I didn't include them in the presentation, but just wanted you to be able to see this. Delacroix wrote in his journal, quote, "Man has in his soul innate sentiments which real objects would never satisfy. And it is to these sentiments that the imagination of the painter and the poet is able to give form and life." And what I think is interesting about this is that he says that real objects will never satisfy the sentiments that man has in his soul, but painting, of course, is a real object. And I think this kind of materialism of paint, the fact that paint was material, Delacroix spoke out often against bourgeois materialism. There was always the question of how paint could kind of justify its own materiality, or how maybe it could distract the viewer from its materiality. Because the idea of internalizing the image again as a sketch, that I do think constitutes a dematerialization of the work. So this idea, real objects will never satisfy us, but yet I am going to spend my life creating more and more real objects, is a really interesting paradox for Delacroix. And the question to ask is, how can the painter combat the realness of painting? And one more kind of quote from the journal that sort of expresses Delacroix's own sense that even the act of perception in itself was dissatisfying. The mind is so imperfect, so difficult to arrest, that the man most sensitive to the arts feels in the presence of a fine work a kind of disquiet, a difficulty in delighting in it completely. And this passage I actually take from, this is Michelle Hanouch's translation of the passage, and her work discusses this quote in light of the idea that the temporality of the imagination inherently struggled with the fixedness or the presence of the work of art. So, and that is what Delacroix is kind of trying to express there, that painting could never be exactly like the mind. Painting could never imitate the imagination in the imagination's ability to present images. So the conclusion that I've come to on this is that Delacroix wanted somehow to negotiate the way that painting made things material. How could he develop a materialism that yet retained the fleeting and mobile character of the imagination? Now, in the work itself, and this is when we go into the gallery, what I'd like to discuss, I think there are two kinds of materiality that come into play. The first kind is the representation of physical material bodies. And that's something that we've talked about a lot today with Medea, and then Medea's, the goddess figure, kind of how Delacroix represents physical bodies. Also, Darcy Grigsby's talk yesterday about these kinds of the one-footed woman, the body that doesn't quite cohere. Also, everything that Claire pointed out yesterday about the sort of the anatomical imperfectedness and incorrectness of Delacroix's bodies. So that when he's representing the human body, I think he's thinking about this kind of materiality or physicality and how to almost create a painting that doesn't quite appropriately represent a real sort of physical presence. And then, of course, the other kind of materiality is the material of paint itself, the material of finish, which is the title of our exhibition. And I think that both of these materialities, the materiality of paint and the materiality of the body, Delacroix sought to negotiate, to modify according to the demands of the imagination for an image that was not bound by material form. And just to quickly talk about a few ideas of the body of the subject, I think that increasingly the problem of painting's materiality begins to be expressed in Delacroix through the material of the human body. And I was really influenced in writing this talk by Nina's essay on Paganini and the body of the violin player, and sort of an idea that there was a certain ideology of romantic corporeality that sought to represent a kind of a body that was not quite physically present, as a way of sort of saying the emphasis is on the spirit, the emphasis is on the spirituality of the artist, not on his body. These kinds of, these elongated legs, again, the kind of this really nipped in waist, not a sort of powerful physical presence in the way that perhaps, you know, a Michelangelesque figure might be. Although I think that in this painting of Michelangelo, what Delacroix is kind of riffing on in that is, of course, Dürer's Melancholia. And to go with Panofsky's interpretation of melancholia as the melancholy of being confronted with physical, the sort of unbearable physicality of life, and how can the artist kind of transcend it in some way. The contrast between the Cupid that's busily scribbling, not sort of bothered by this metaphysical paradox, and Melancholia herself, who has her hand on her cheek on her hand, is sort of overwhelmed by the thought of how to kind of work with the materiality of art. And then I also show you Michelangelo's Prisoner, and I want to think about the idea of the prisoner as being imprisoned in material, being imprisoned in paint, imprisoned in the body, imprisoned in the block. So that despite the fact that this is quite a physically present sculpture, the underlying kind of thing that it's trying to express is being free of the block, being free of the material condition. And a couple places where I think in the exhibition we can turn to that are with Marcus Aurelius's body, and also I'm interested in Commodus's body in different ways. And then finally, just to quickly talk about the body of painting, I think I don't have any great details, but I can refer back to the wonderful details that Eric showed us, and the kind of what Claire talked about yesterday, the blobs of impasto, and you know how a blob itself, the sort of a blob of paint, is that really, the blob of paint, it's a very physical thing, it's very material, we see the blob of paint, but what does it represent? It's this kind of, it hovers between representing and not representing. And that's one way, and one question I'd like to ask in the exhibition is how can paint disembody itself? How can paint sort of say, I'm very paint-like, I'm very material, but ultimately I want you not to think about that. I want you to make an image. And I think Eric did a great job of bringing that out earlier today when you were talking about how Delacroix, despite spending so much time thinking about technique and making beautifully technically executed things, he said, we must avoid the infernal facility of the brush. He didn't want the sort of materiality of his paint just to be that. He wanted it to be something that inspired thought. And a final kind of way that I'd like to propose thinking about this kind of idea is actually in the concept, in terms of a certain 18th century idea for thinking about the unfinished or sketchy work. And I refer here to Miriam Hobson's book, The Object of Art, and to a process that she describes, and that was also described in the critical literature of the time as papillotage, so butterfly-like flickering, and that this process is a flickering back and forth between consciousness of the work itself, of the object in front of you, and the idea that it suggests in your mind. So consciousness of the work and consciousness also of oneself and of the way that mentally we absorb the image and think about it. And I show you Fragonard's, one of his figures de fantaisie, these fantasy portraits that are so incredibly virtuosic in their expressive brushwork. And that certainly, we have briefly touched upon the way that the 18th century and the 18th century handling was important to Delacroix, and I think we can kind of see in this suggestion of not only the way the garment itself seems to kind of flicker, it almost has a flame-like quality in itself, but the way that our attention constantly goes back and forth between seeing the material quality of the paint and understanding that what is represented is a figure, that it's not just paint. So this movement back and forth, which Hobson has referred to as papillotage. And I would also like to point out a really interesting detail, and we can look at the facsimile, but Delacroix, the conservative critic who had been in David's studio, said of Massacre of Chios that it reminded him of Watteau, that the ground, the fond of the canvas reminded him of Watteau. And you think, what does this battle scene, or weird battle scene, have to do with the Fête Galante? And it was simply in terms of the way the paint was handled. And Delacroix also thought that morally, that this kind of way of handling paint to him smacked not only of the style of the 18th century, but the loose morals of the 18th century. So perhaps some of this idea of the saleté, of the dirtiness of the figures, could be connected to some idea of kind of a louche lifestyle of the 18th century. And just finally, to close, we've heard a lot as well about Delacroix's fear of the perishing of his work, this kind of obsession that he had with his works disappearing entirely. But perhaps it's a kind of, methinks the lady doth protest too much, to quote from Hamlet, but a certain kind of idea that, in a way, maybe he was sort of obsessed with the idea that they could perish, because that would mean that there would be no material trace left. There would only be what people could remember in their own imagination. So those are the ideas that I want to put out there, and I hope we can kind of talk about them in the galleries. And I guess, does anyone, we can go straight to the galleries, or we can take questions here, or I don't know. Galleries? Galleries.
I think you're standing next to a souvenir.
Yes, you are.
Oh, yeah, the
This? Oh. Well, it's not called souvenir. Pleasures, yes, but yes, it does seem to be a souvenir. Souvenir of Fontainebleau, yeah.
Well, did anyone think that sort of complements imagination? And I love the way you approach it.
Thank you.
Is the science. Did you want to say a few more about it? Because, his science, what he refers to as his science, isn't, observing or, looking under the microscope. What is the role of whatever you call science that complements this, this triangle of the imagination?
I think you have to tell me that. Because this is exposing the fact that I am not a Delacroix specialist, but what does he say about?
I don't think it's only Delacroix. I think,
Yeah.
This is,
Okay.
science is sort of floating all over the place. It's something that is inherited from the 18th century that they're really trying to resolve in the 19th century, but its presence
Okay, yeah.
is so palpable.
I would say in relationship to that, to refer to one author that I'm trying to kind of bring back into, because I think he's really great on Delacroix, is Mras, M-R-A-S. I don't know, but the article, there's from the 60s, an Art Bulletin article about the sketch and the imagination, and what he does say is that ultimately Delacroix is very reasonable and rational about producing this effect. So it's calculated, this kind of, the entire sort of passion of, that he wants to inspire. He thinks that the artist is the one who scientifically perhaps or rationally can control and produce those effects. So that's what I would say, that it's this very kind of calculated enterprise. Yeah.
Marco, that was a wonderful paper. I enjoyed it very much. And I just wanted to ask you, when you talk about, being aware of paint and then the way paint is also depicting something as such, I was wondering, were you, there's what I understand is a general one of the most famous articulations of that is Richard Wollheim's seeing in and seeing as. So I was wondering, was it that particular kind of sense that you meant it in terms of, or I was thinking when you referred to the wonderful slides Eric and Anne have shown, that particular sort of like wonderful awareness we have that Wollheim's original sort of, kind of fairly pedantic sort of illusionism versus the painted surface gives way, in fact, when you see the details, to that tremendous kind of play between layers of glazes and then dabs of impasto and complicated still further by the varnish. So there's kind of like an infinite variation on that basic, kind of seeing and then seeing as kind of dynamic.
Yeah, definitely. What was the first example that you mentioned?
Richard Wollheim?
Yeah.
Oh, so he's talking about Gombrich's work, and so he's talking about the moment when you see, for example, classically, say Corot, for example, and then you sort of see it on the wall in the gallery, and you see it as a copse beside the Seine or whatever, and then as you establish a relationship with that painting, you see it as a painting and not as a representation.
Right.
I think it's from, I forget which Walheim text it is, but it's the only phrase I can remember from a otherwise huge book that I couldn't really kind of, but that really struck me as very meaningful. Just that kind of moment when you keep the two moments of a picture, like the Mont Saint Victoire as motif and the Mont Saint Victoire as the accumulation of brush strokes. You have that kind of hovering, and you hold it within your mind.
Definitely. I think there's so many ways we can think about the material visible facture of Delacroix, and I think that's definite. Yes, and I guess I was talking about several different ways, but yes, one way is the oscillation between the painting as object and the painting as image, and that he plays with that, but also that. But I guess what I want to stress is that I think the point of that ultimately was to forget that the painting was an object at all. Right. Or he talks about, there's one passage that I didn't quote where he says, well, if the painting wasn't there, if you're thinking about the painting but it's not there before you, it's actually probably better because you can then you can imagine it, you can recreate it in your imagination, and in that recreation of it, you will imagine it as better than it really was. And I wonder maybe we could even connect that to Lecoq not allowing his students to see any other works of art. If you can, that way the imagination would be forced to exercise itself more vigorously.
Great, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was wondering, and I don't know if anybody else here knows, because one thing when you're talking about calling attention to the kind of image and the falseness of the image through the material, and that is pertinent to the exhibition, and we've talked about it, is his relationship to Rubens. And of course, Rubens writes on things like this, like on the imitation of statuary, calling attention, or on color, calling attention to the falseness of the surface and how that can be pleasurable. And of course, this is picked up in the 18th century by Roger de Guiche and elsewhere. And so it'd be interesting, like I don't remember calling in the journal him talking about reading any of Rubens' writings, and I think that's very,
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I do know that if anything, well, I mean, obviously there's the beautiful copy of the figure from the Marie de Medici cycle in the galleries, which I think it would be fun to look at because I actually think that that is one of the more material bodies that is on view in the exhibition. And but I was struck by Claire's comparison of the impasto in Rubens and the impasto in Delacroix, and I think Delacroix definitely seems to have, his impasto seems to be far more blob-like in the kind of, Rubens' impasto is so carefully calculated, each highlight follows a contour versus a kind of this sort of texturing of the surface for its own sake. But I do think that certainly Delacroix's relationship to Rubens is very interesting. And, I mean, if anything you can say, I would also say that Watteau, the Delacroix Watteau and Watteau's interest in Rubens is another important chain of tradition there. Yes?
So in thinking about Delacroix's imagination, isn't it really close to link that to the idea of the romantic musical composer, with Liszt and Chopin, who are both friends and acquaintances and friends of Delacroix, after all, who are creating, in a sense, in their music, the idea in the mind, in the way that Delacroix is trying to do in the same sense. And I think that's quite a strong link there to romantic music.
Yes, and Nina did talk about that yesterday with Chopin, the etude, the study, the incomplete.
Sorry.
No. But also, I would also say that one thing that Michel Anouche draws out about Delacroix in the journal is that Delacroix describes the paint. He's always talking about how painting's silent and how that's actually a good thing because then you can imagine the music that would accompany it. So that in that sense, painting allows itself to be accompanied by not only the imagination, but the imagination of music as well. She uses this great expression to say that painting is a silent dandy. It has a dandified silence about it because it refuses to respond orally to the spectator. So yeah, the music relationship is great. In fact, I think that we should all just go into the gallery and stand silently while some music plays, and then I won't have to lead a discussion.
We were planning on having music in the galleries as soon as, honestly, speakers are kind of, we would like to play some Chopin. I keep on wanting to introduce Mozart just because Delacroix claimed to prefer the calm of Mozart.
The rational.
The rational,
yeah,
the classical.
exactly.
So again, this misapprehension, I suppose, deliberately of his own self. The one thing that because this image this is one of those things that always haunts me, this image. I love this painting very much, but it just makes me recall what we were just looking at before in terms of drapery. And one of the great, I think, accomplishments of Delacroix is to return the expressiveness to drapery by making it completely non-mimetic in its inability to follow the contours of a supposed human form, but rather to leap to its own incredible, death-defying. I mean, this kind of crazy drapery is exactly the kind of drapery that you find over and over again in Delacroix. There is a joy and a pleasure and a burst of energy that comes from that non-mimetic willingness to distort. And that's the part of Delacroix that I find so compelling and fascinating, that he was able to reinvent that all on his own. Well, obviously not all on his own, but by looking at people like I don't know. But yes, unless you had something else you want. Anne, did you have something you wanted to say before we go? No. But yes.
Well, I think when you talk about the very transparent layers and the impasto on top of one another, this is very much part of his demateriality, because the layers are sequential. And where they overlap, they breed density. And then to put a blob of impasto on top of it is really to give the object much more life. And I think the same thing is done in one of the Delacroix in the gallery with the outline of the figure. And it's really quite extraordinary because it pulls you in two different planes at the same time. And it's generally all with one color. It's all with the, with different tones of the same color. And I was particularly stunned by that when Eric showed the slides, the details. I wanted to see that again and again, because the construction is so amazing that it's the precision of those images are just startling.
Abby is a painter, if you could not discern that before. And she'll be speaking to us a little bit later about Delacroix and paint, and literally the materiality of paint in the way that you just were discussing. But why don't we go and try and drag this thread with us into the gallery?
Do I wear this? Mark and I were talking about this painting earlier, but if you really get close to it, this is, not only is this one of those bodies these bodies that can't support themselves. If we look at almost this whole wall, 4 paintings in a row, it's bodies that are, somebody else is supporting them, so bodies that can't stand on their own. That painting, the Fanatics of Tangiers, and I wonder also this kind of, the body is taken over by this sort of emotional frisson and then becomes unable to stand any longer. And we were talking about, Guru, the sublime possession of the body, and that kind of thing I thought was an interesting theme. But just, this is a great example of the kind of what we might want to call papillotage, the red of the blood that is on these. You see it right here on the arrow, and the arrow is just, the blade of the arrow is just indicated by one little bit of white paint. And then if you just if you get a little closer, you see on the ground scattered are the arrows that have already been removed. Each one is also only indicated by that little tiny dot of red paint. So, you know, when is it just a dot of paint and when is it a dot of blood? And also blood is, blood itself being this substance that hovers between, of course, a liquid character, a material character of paint, and a liquid character, and then also a representational object. So blood and paint and please, I want people to comment. People have comments.
So we were looking at this earlier, and just to get more gross, we want to, since there are these arrows on the ground that are dipped in blood, we have to imagine that our minds go backwards, and we imagine that each of these arrows being pulled out of his body one at a time over a sequence lasting 3, 5, 8 minutes, and we're deliberately sort of compelled to imagine backwards like that through these bloody arrows. The Saint Sebastian, you know, usually has like lots and lots of arrows. So you start going in this direction, and the picture becomes very disturbing and upsetting, despite this sort of Delacroix elegiac aspect.
And in a way, it's a much more, what's the word I'm looking for, distressing imagining these arrows one by one than if we saw Saint Sebastian with 12 arrows still in him.
Yeah.
Right.
He never looks really
It's much more
nice to
provocative,
us.
isn't it, that you imagine it.
But on the other hand, something that sort of balances it is, you know, this focused look on Saint Irene and, you know, how time stops as she's slowly pulling this out, and our entire focus on that as well. So there is a sort of tension between, on the one hand, imagining it one by one, on the other hand, this single moment.
Yeah, and I think, you know, also just this point about imagining what came before and after, that was a fairly classical way of describing the moment that history painting was supposed to represent, that you were supposed to be able to infer from one image what happened before, what happened afterwards. So in a way that, and I've been really interested about thinking about Delacroix's classicism over the course of the symposium. So again, he's making that kind of, but then he's also kind of making your experience of the painting also have this temporal progression from one blob, one dot of red to the next. So yeah.
I have a question, maybe even more for Goldie than for Marika, which is, if we had this painting by Jérôme, some of this we would still be imagining the same.
Absolutely.
So I'm wondering what you think some of the major differences would be if we had an imaginary Jérôme there with the same subject.
That's a fantastic question. I think certainly the arrows would have been sharper, would have been better defined, but I think we would still have the drops of red as drops of red.
And so we would still go through imagining this.
We would certainly, exactly. The landscape in the background would have been more determined. I think the profil perdu, we would have gotten that, and I don't think Jérôme really would have given more detail. The brushwork would have been less fuzzy, but we wouldn't have had a better sense of what that face looks like, because Jérôme is also very much interested in these sort of, you know, microscopic details that you really need to get very close to, and you squint your eyes, and it still doesn't come sharp. So actually there are bizarrely lots of overlaps in this sort of small detail.
Yeah, and I actually think to bring up the one Jérôme painting that I know somewhat well because of my dissertation, Pierre, the painting, the duel after the bal masqué. Yeah, that painting shows, he shows the way the body has been dragged over the snow, so that you see the position that it was in, the position that it has become, so that in this very detailed academic way, he expands the temporality of the moment just as much as Delacroix does at times.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something I talk about in my book, the clue structure. He gives these clues to you. It's not only that you add up, you sort of, you know, bring it together in your mind, and then you imagine what what led up to that.
And you've written about that with the arena, right?
Yeah.
If it was a Jerome, you'd probably find hundreds and hundreds of people around, like angry and yelling, and they like the Christian movie.
Nothing to do after the masquerade.
No, well, there's imagined people in front of the theater.
Actually, I was just saying to Ike, and we have a Perot from about the same period of the same subject, which he worked on over like about 3 decades, which is a humongous painting. But it's the same very intimate little triangle in front.
Of Saint Sebastian after he's been taken off of the tree.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's the same with no arrows in it.
No arrows.
So it's the same moment. Yeah, and it's a really lovely piece. But of course, it's mostly a landscape with these little figures in the center.
Souvenir to Saint.
And it's humongous.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is it might have been a deliberate choice on Delacroix's part is the sort of the softness of all the forms, the roundness here, the roundness, the almost sort of rubbery quality of the arms. And then the only sharp things in the whole painting are these razor sharp arrows that are all over the place. Every single other stroke is, you know, it's softer, it's blended, it's or maybe not blended, but the color tonalities are such that they don't stand out.
Well, also the use of the really sharp white to bring
Yeah,
out the sharp
exactly.
object.
It seems to me it's also like what you started with, is that in addition to this roundness, it's this blurriness and almost atmospheric quality, that things that are supposedly palpable and material, but end up being immaterial.
That is one of the more hallucinatory paintings in this entire installation. And it's funny because actually that's exactly what the critic pointed out too in his interpretation, was the conflicted emotions in the relief that she knows she will give to him by removing this arrow, but then also the anticipation of the pain that she's inflicting. So there's this kind of edge to the sentiment of that centralized little blip that represents the arrow. So and it's actually an extraordinary picture, which I think gets so little attention at LACMA, it's not even funny. But it really is amazing. And what's even more amazing, the more you look at it, is, again, I know that my contact lenses are very sticky from allergies, but it is so blurry and indistinct. It's really extraordinary that is something that he intentionally leaves to your imagination.
Yeah, I was also, when Claire, you talked about rocks, the rocks in the Kimball's picture, and here we've got quite a few rocks, but I was thinking of one artist who really picks up on that, rocks and water, is Courbet later, and uses kind of rocks and water as this sort of a pretense for a kind of exploration of paint and impasto and all those things. So
Maybe one more thing about the sort of implicit tension in this painting is that the early sketches that he makes for the 1836 version, there's this one watercolor in which you have Saint Sebastian on his own in the left, and now you have Medea with the kids in the right. So from the beginning onwards, when he's mulling this over, he's also mulling Medea over, and it's fascinating on the one hand, you know, you have the Saint Irene in attendant, this care, this love, you know, to this body that has been treated horribly. But, you know, he's isolating them. He's just putting Sebastian there, and next to them is Medea, and with all her, you know, brewing violence inside. So, you know, she's very much, and then I think it's Théophile Gautier who sort of sees in the attendant in the 1836 version, like she again has a profil perdu. She sees the Medea in the attendant, basically, again, half of the face in shadow. So, you know, again, there's something, some implicit violence in the structure of this painting.
I would like to go to the Marcus Aurelius too, yeah. And then I think those are the main. You know, I really loved when Nina was talking about the kind of the way that Commodus stands out in this painting as the romantic flower amidst this kind of classical gloom, but that Delacroix prepares the way for this figure to be exertable, to be exerted and to go into the imagination and to have a life there, in the mind of a critic, in the mind of whoever perceived the painting. And just to tie that into the idea of kind of history painting and the crisis of history painting and the idea that there are certain figures who escape history painting, who escape narrative. And by escaping narrative, they acquire their own lives, a life outside of the canvas, exterior to the narrative in which they're originally shown. And of course that is what the story, the idea that he looks bored, what Gautier said, he looks bored, he wants to get out of there, And Gautier is always talking about figures coming off the wall, populating spaces, reanimating.
Oh, I'd forgotten that about Gautier.
Yeah, he does. He loves things that come to life. There's one short story with a Rococo tapestry, Omphale, where Omphale comes out every night and basically molests this, willingly. He allows himself to be molested, but a character inside the room. So that's another way that kind of that painters could create things that would have this imaginative life outside the work. So.
Well, I love the way you put that. I mean, it's so beautifully phrased, and I feel like, you've just exactly expressed what I was attempting to forge there. So I'm really glad that you continued the narrative into this painting. Yeah, and absolutely, I hadn't realized it, but yeah, that kind of preparation, there's a developmental arc there, absolutely. Nina, did you?
I wonder, are there any other comments about kind of history painting and the imagination? That's a pretty open-ended. Don't be like my undergrad, say something. Yeah.
And this is, it may be an unanswerable question, but when you were speaking in the PowerPoint, of all the questions that you asked us, this one came to mind. And that is, if I can think of how to phrase this, that when we're talking about the materiality of the paint, but we're also talking about how an individual's imagination sort of takes off from the painting and imagines things in whatever way that the person desires. Do you think that there is a difference between you or anyone else, a difference between late 20th century, early 21st century imagination and early 19th century imagination? So that Delacroix really maybe has, not something totally different in mind, but something somewhat different in mind as far as imagination.
Well, that's a...
that's why I said it might not be an answerable question, but it was triggered because of the distinctions that you were making about memory and souvenir and imagination.
I mean, I think that one thing that interests me, and it's not a direct answer, but is the extent to which there were certain figures shared imaginatively by different romantic communities. So different kind of clubs or cenacles, these groups that got together, would often have a shared repertoire of figures. For example, Gautier and Nerval shared the image of a blonde woman with dark eyes. That was taken, of course, from Rubens, but they shared a kind of, that imagination tended to, amongst a close group of people, imagination tended to fixate on similar scenarios, similar time periods, similar stories. And I mean, if just we look at all the different kind of moments of revival in 19th century painting, it shows again the kind of, like Henri IV was in everyone's imagination apparently, and kind of circulating there. So certainly the kind of, the sort of just, I don't know, I'm not an expert, but for contemporary art, you don't get the sense of these kinds of, the group, the way that the romantic group of poets and of artists and of musicians, the way that that affected the kind of imaginative repertoire from which you could draw. So,
Oh, thank you.
Well, I think the groups are definitely exist. They're just in, they're just multiple
Yeah.
groups here.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there's no single group that predominates.
Right, right.
But there are shared images. You think of the pop artists, and not that they're contemporary, but you know, you think of there have been definitely there's always an exchange of ideas.
Yep.
Yeah. Gorky and de Kooning, and you know, and this is continued.
Well, I mentioned the Italian artists who were thinking about the surface of the painting, Fontana and Zoni and Bonaluni. And there's two others, one of the name. And they were all in this little group in the 60s and 70s, and very much a distinct group, trying to create works of art where the surface was as much important as the idea of the painting itself. So that sort of coincided with your idea of materialism of the painter.
Yeah, it was slashing the canvases. One final point I just wanted to make was about the Delacroix habit of replication and just the series that we get with the Marcus Aurelius. But I think that the building up studies prior to the work and then copying the work afterwards, it was what I was trying to suggest earlier when I was talking about the multiple Hamlets. They're all Hamlet, but they're multiple images. I think it was a project of his. It was part of, replication was part of ensuring posterity, but it was also about multiplying the possible images that you could kind of, showing that the image was always being reimagined, even by the artist himself. Even when he wants to retouch the bark of Dante, that's making a new work. So this continual, and the fact that Delacroix often, there were several Othello and Desdemona, several Saint Sebastians, several of all the themes that he was interested in. It was about expanding the range of possible, showing all these different imagined versions of the same thing. So, I think we see that it's so interesting that some of these studies were made after, not before, the actual history painting. So,
Perhaps I'll just note whether those different imagined versions were supposed to have different effects on the viewers, or they're supposed to generate different sets of emotions and experiences on the viewers?
Well, certainly there's something very different about seeing things small, from the sketch to the large painting. But I think fundamentally it showed that Delacroix was willing to reimagine his work. That he didn't think there was no definitive Marcus Aurelius. There was a motif that could be reimagined and redone many times. I think that's one thing. I think also that it was about wanting as many people to see it as possible. The more versions you have, the more likely people will be able to see it. It was about kind of spreading these figures into the kind of collective imagination, or trying to even build something like a collective imagination, maybe.
And does the same thing. He repeats his subjects over and over again, changing the composition slightly.
Yeah.
But throughout his career, he had done something in 1812 and then repeated in 1850. Presumably, he always trying to improve it, though, in his case. Not necessarily does he wants to improve every time.
And I was also in preparation for this thinking about Norman Bryson and tradition and desire and the multiplication of works. And he talks about Ingres' multiplication of his figures, constant reference to other works that, and you could think of the two pavilions, the Ingres versus Delacroix pavilions. It's the two virtual worlds that both of them have created. And they want to be the dominant world of the imagination for that moment.
And in line with that, because one of the things that really has begun to strike me more and more about Delacroix and history painting, as you say, but really in terms of any type of subject, is how elusive he is, because he invents subjects that really don't exist in the history of art, except for in fragmentary form in other contexts. Mm-hmm. And then he assembles them, so that there's a level of recognition, maybe in the way that you mean, in terms of a single figure that captures your attention because it resonates somehow in the imagination and in memory. But the entire composition is almost always an amalgam from so many disparate sources that you can't recognize a consistent iconographical class.
That's exactly right.
And you know, that to me is one of the most remarkable achievements of this. You know, I'm actually thinking, Mark, if I think about the 19th century in terms of the greater academic context, that's probably actually true of the entire 19th century in academic practice. And the same is true of Gérôme in the search for a new class of subject matter and the reinvention of history painting. But what's so incredible about Delacroix is that, you know, this is the juxtaposition for me, but that the Sultan of Morocco can actually have such a deep iconographical basis in so many deeply Western things, but it's masked to the extent that you don't necessarily consciously recognize it. And it's only through, you know, idiots like me who are pinpointing the sources that you ruin the magic of the universal effect. And it seems to me that that's what he really is attempting, and that's the most ambitious thing you can attempt, is a universal expression that is not rooted in any specific moment in time or civilization. And you know, that is idealism to, you know, despite all of the darkness. I mean, that there's something incredibly optimistic about that kind of vision. And maybe it has to be hallucinatory. Maybe it has to be a dream, because it can't actually have a concrete reality.
Well, it just reminds me of the section Eugène Delacroix in the Salon of 1846, when, you know, there's that section where he talks, you know, Delacroix is universal, but there's also that, you know, funny little moment at the beginning of that section where he says, I'm taking out all my best pens, and there's like it's such a kind of a sweet moment and a naive moment, and then you're like launched straight into the universality of it. So it's, you know, there's kind of like, there's also, that's the sort of, there's a naivety in Baudelaire that Delacroix kind of transforms, that he gets in Baudelaire, but what you've both been talking about is that like incredible reach, you know, but when you appreciate it, you do feel obliged to, you know, dust yourself off and sort of put on your best bib and tucker, as Baudelaire, the 21-year-old Baudelaire did.
One of the challenges of this oldest painting, Delacroix and his contemporaries, is they, as you say, they find universality in the contingent. So they throw themselves into the stream of history, and whether it is English history or French history, certainly French history, and finding subjects in antiquity that have never been portrayed before. And one of the problems that comes from that is we don't know what the pictures mean, and they're not fixed for us around certain canonical types that we're familiar with, so we're having to go searching through this historical stream that for them is very liberating. We're trying to go searching for sort of life, for, what do they call life, those things that you throw when you drown? Things that allow us to stabilize the representation and attach it to something that we recognize. So here, you know, we have male nudes or other things that are useful for us that establish it as part of a series that we recognize. But I think one of the reasons why romantic painting is so difficult, whether the subject is classical or Orientalist or British history or French history, troubadour painting, and so on and so forth, the difficulty of the subjects for modern audiences lies in this fascination with the contingent and their embrace of the stream of the historical past and of different historical epochs. And didn't you mention that this is a rarely portrayed subject?
Yes.
Or never previously portrayed? And that's a really tough, it's one of the great inventions of the Romantic era, was the idea of portraying a subject, a historical subject that someone hadn't portrayed yet. But it really comes at a heavy price, which is a loss of legibility.
That's right. Well, I guess if we are feeling okay, then we can return to hear Abby's final presentation.
The material.
The day, and hopefully this is a real treat for us. So here, let me explain the logic of this in case you were wondering why we have this renowned painter in our midst. It isn't really to hawk her art, although I love her art dearly. It's really because in her own approach to art making, she has an intimate knowledge of the making of the material of paint. And I just thought it would be very educational to have her perspective and to just listen to the way that she responds to what she sees in Delacroix's art. So with no further ado, Abby.
Well, I'd like to thank Ike, not only for giving me the opportunity to speak here, but even more so to giving me the opportunity to listen here, because it's been a really fulfilling 2 days. I think the imagination and the ingenuity with which Ike assembled today, and not to give you short shrift, Lauren, is really fantastic, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it all. I think the thing that I learned most about Delacroix is in Marc's precision, in Marc's very apt juxtaposition between desire and ability. This was a theme that Marika took up as well. And I think that that Delacroix has perfectly united his sort of philosophic goal with the actual way that he applies paint onto canvas. And I never really understood that until these past couple of days. And that's something I think that every artist struggles with, the ability of the fleeting image in the imagination, as Marika put it, and the gap between the artist's lack of ability to put that onto canvas. And I know for myself, the minute I make a dot on a blank canvas, the minute I make a stroke, I have an image in my mind. The image is very elusive. The minute I make a dot, I have a problem because it's not the image that I wanted. And I spend the rest of the time that I'm working on that painting trying to get back to the original elusive image. And there's a real conversation between the marks on the canvas and the paint and my own vision. And when the conversation stops, when there's absolutely nothing I can do to make this more like the image in my mind, then the painting's done. And I start all over again, and it's the same process again. And basically, I had, you know, this is one, I came to using pigments because I found that there was a clumsiness that I was finding when I squeezed out like a toothpaste, paint with the texture of toothpaste. And I tried to make it transparent. I've always been very interested in transparency and layering. And I found, so I went to, you know, I researched it, I tried different products, nothing seemed to really work. There's probably the most common product available is something called Liquin, and it has a kind of unappealing spongy texture, and it doesn't really do what it's supposed to do. And it also changes the color slightly of the paint. And so then I thought, well, maybe I should try a water-based paint, because I began painting in watercolor, and that medium was very suited to
the way that I like to paint. But then I thought, well, maybe I'll just try acrylics. And the acrylics had a really bouncy, rubbery texture. And I was very disturbed at my inability to get what I wanted. So I finally tried pigments. And the minute that I did, I thought, I'll never go back. I thought what I would do is sort of talk about it a little bit. And then I'd like to pass them around. Probably they should be kept closed in this room full of masterpieces so that we don't sprinkle pigments all over the paintings. There's only one I'd like to, well, I'll get to that when I show it, when I get to that. I think, you know, just prior to the history of the Industrial Revolution, there were very limited choice and what is now known as historical pigments. I've brought in 2 charts from the same company of historic pigments, and I just happened to own these 2 charts because I was going somewhere and I didn't want to, you know, I bought another chart to take with me because I was going to be there for a while. And then when I compared them, I was quite startled because the same colors by the same company looked very different on the 2 charts. And probably one was a chart that was, probably one was in winter, some of the pigments were gathered in winter or different weather conditions, and others in summer. Because some of the pigments are really much faded from one to the other, and some don't lose at all. And I think if you look at them, there's the smalt is very different, the smalt is very different, the red ochre from Castile is very different. There's a pigment called orpiment that I did not even know was orpiment, which is a pigment that I use. Orpiment has arsenic in it, and it was one of the common pigments it was one of the common ways of making yellow. One way in the malachite is very different, and the lapis is very different, all on this color chart. So I just thought I'd bring it in and show you that even nowadays there are, with pigments, when they're probably much more carefully controlled chemically than Delacroix was. You know, I'm sure that, well, there's a global manufacturer of pigments. I didn't know, so prior to the Industrial Revolution, there were just a limited range of colors available. And the most expensive, of course, is lapis and Fra Angelico blue, that which is known as Fra Angelico blue, to this day sells for 15,000 euros for a kilo. And many of the, I mean, I have a number of different lapises, and there's a snobbery among what lapis you have. But I happen to have, I guess, banal taste because I like one of the less expensive lapises the best, and that's lapis from Chile, which I find to be a less dominant lapis than the lapis from, say, Afghanistan. If you use the very tiniest quantities of pure lapis from Afghanistan, it will dominate any area that it's in. And they also came prior to the Industrial Revolution, of course, from mineral sources, and lapis, jasper, azurite, vermilion, which was made from Chinese cinnabar, is made from Chinese cinnabar, were very popular, along with yellows made from lead, and also yellows containing arsenics. These are all used today. And I finally stopped using lead yellows because I thought, you know, come on, what's the point? It was just the toxicity of the possible inhalation and spreading around and made it you know, I just felt it was foolish to continue. On the other hand, I happily use the arsenic-based yellow because I have no intention of eating my paint, so it doesn't matter. But there are, you know, I brought in an ultramarine ash, which is made from lapis ash. And that says on the package, cancerous. Because it's and you know, these things, now some of them are not allowed in the States. Some of them are old, and I had before they weren't allowed in the States. And sometimes I've just brought them in. If it's something like the arsenic yellow, which isn't actually harmful, but where they don't want to be selling arsenic, you know, I've just brought it in. There were also pigments traditionally, and this still exists, from biological sources. And the sepia that I brought in is the one color that I hope you'll open up and carefully sniff, because it still smells like the sea. And that's made from Adriatic cuttlefish. And it's astounding. I probably had that 8 or 9 years, and it still smells like the sea. And then there was also an Indian yellow that Vermeer was very fond of. And that particular Indian yellow was made with the urine from cows in India that had only been fed mango leaves. And Vermeer was very fond of this pigment, and he used to use it a great deal for sunlight. And one of his patrons kidded him and said, oh, you know, I see you made your wife's portrait using a lot of this cow pee on her. So, and many painters, just getting back to the blues, well, getting back to two things. One thing is that painters really wanted to control their supply of pigments. And Cranach even had his own apothecary. And Fra Angelico insisted, when he signed a contract to do something, that it be specified how many precious pigments he had the right to use. And Van Eyck used to charge extra if you wanted him to put blue in the painting. Anyhow, getting back, the other, a few more biological pigments are the cochineal reds from which the carmines are made. And correct me if I don't pronounce that properly, but the alizarins and the carmines are made from that. And Tyrian purple, which comes from a snail. And the process of making this from a snail is very, very time-consuming. And so purple and the blues became very associated with royalty. The synthetic pigments came in with the Industrial Revolution, and these were chemically modified natural substances. So you'd have something like a copper pigment, which might have been made with white lead and vinegar in the presence of CO2. And there was a lot of effort that went into finding inexpensive substitutes for the blues. And cobalt, which had been made from glass and existed before the Industrial Revolution, but it became more widely spread. And the reds were largely replaced that had been used before, so that I have some of the older pigments because I'm just fascinated by it. And also because they're so incredibly beautiful. I mean, the vermilions that exist. And there's another pigment that I brought in. Well, I think I'm going to pass around some of the pigments now. And so I'll just This is the chart, and I would suggest when you look at this that you compare, well, there's one, I'll just show you where to find them. Like these, you're not going to see it too well from there. But this blue and this blue, they're both lapis from the same company, of the same quality. Kremer makes over 1,000 pigments. This is the company that I used. And it was sort of a no-brainer to switch to Kremer because he's a chemist. And the quality of his pigments and the specificity of what's in there is astounding. For example, when I was in France, I bought a Sennelier, which is a very well-known brand, pigment in red, to see what it looked like, because you can't really predict what it's going to be like. You take, the pigments come as powder. You add oil to them, which immediately changes the color considerably. And you don't know the tinting strength. You don't really understand the texture. And you don't know just how dense, how opaque the pigment is going to be. So I bought this thing, which is labeled in a totally meaningless way, pure pigment. That's all this thing says, is pure pigment. It's a pigment pur, a cadmium red substitute. And then you look at the side labels, and they tell you that it's a substitute, PR4. They tell you nothing. And this is the way the art store sells the pigment. So I thought, well, this makes no sense at all, because you really have no idea. So I sort of like realized that that was not a path that I wanted to follow. I brought in several other reds. And the first one is just a beautiful color. It's vermilion. And I brought in, one is a cinnabar. This is, all vermilions are traditionally made with cinnabar, which is a stone. This one happens to come from China, and it's labeled as that. And it's just a beautiful color that's very strong. And I've used it sort of as a finishing surface. And then this is the identical pigment, but it's more finely ground, and the color becomes much, much lighter. So keep them together, and just the grinding, the fineness of the grind changes the color enormously. And then I brought in two matters, and these are roots, and one of them is this is like a difficult pigment to work with. It's so beautiful, but it's extremely grainy and very, very difficult to break down. And then I also brought in another form of madder, which is equally difficult, another of the same root, but it's just a gorgeous color also. And this one is sort of a yellowish madder. And these are probably, you know, they're both of, there's no quality difference. Generally, when you work with pigments, when you buy them, the finer grinds tend to be much more expensive. And sometimes they're paler, as the cinnabar. Sometimes they're not. Okay, then I brought in various lapis. This one is lapis from Chile, which I love. And lapis from Chile is like the bottom of the barrel for lapis. But I love it because it's the most translucent, and it doesn't have the tinting power of the other lapises. Then this is a plain quality lapis, probably a coarser grind, but a better quality, a better lapis source. I also brought in Han blue. Han blue is used by Chinese restorers and it dates from the period of the Han Dynasty. And this is a very beautiful, I love this pigment. It's just magnificent. Well, the Chinese of the Han period started to use it, and it was therefore called Han blue. For some of these, you know, the pigments recipes have been lost, and for some of them, they had to recalibrate what the pigments might have been. And Kremer, who I've met, the guy that runs the company, I happened to meet because he came to New York. Well, I had ordered from Germany from him. And I sort of got to know the lady who helped me on the phone in Germany. And it was always the same woman because I don't speak German. And then Kremer asked whether, he said he was going to be in New York and would I like to meet him? He'd like to see what I was doing. So I said, oh, yes, of course. And this very formal man comes with a box of Godiva chocolates. And he's a chemist. In fact, if you draw him out a little bit, he told me, I said, how do you get the lapis? And he said, well, I have friends in the military in Afghanistan, and I sort of like talk to them and they let me in. And he does things that one would consider foolhardy, but which he's happy to do. I brought in as well, this is smalt blue, and smalt blue is another very old blue. I concentrated on colors that have been around for a long time. Two forms of azurite, which are very different from one another. One is gray-green, and the other one is sort of almost like cobalt. And this is the pigment that's cancerous. This is ultramarine ash, and it's a byproduct of lapis.
Safety note, because you're absolutely right, especially the cadmiums, and it can get into the skin, and using lead and
Excuse me?
Can I just make a health and safety note that I think that, at least in this country, a lot of art schools are very careful now about, I mean, it's quite a recent initiative, because certainly when I was in art school, we were covered in cadmiums and all sorts of horrible things. But I think that RISD spearheaded a campaign to make the studio as green as possible. So I think there is a growing awareness, amongst, at the student level at least, just to protect, the toxicity levels. And
yes, and I think that it's first I started with a very cavalier attitude, but I've also, I try to substitute. I certainly do not clean my brushes with turpentine. I find it very difficult to substitute for turpentine in doing it, but and most of the pigments that are toxic and all that I brought are more than maybe 10 years old, so that they're not things that I would buy today, but I had them, and therefore I brought them. Okay, and then this is fun. This is Egyptian blue, which is a famous blue that tell me when Egyptian blue was introduced. I feel like it's from the Industrial Revolution.
I think Egyptian blue is before then, isn't it? Egyptian blue
was what?
Is before the Industrial Revolution.
I think so.
Yeah. But I'm not sure. We can Google it.
We can Google it.
Well,
is this the That's the cancer.
That's faience.
So,
I think faience is just kind of glaze. Egyptian blue is probably supposed to mimic that color.
So how long after you put oil in this, how
long can you use it?
Are you Googling Egyptian?
I am.
Well, I think you have to keep the thing as sealed as possible. I'm sure that palette that Delacroix, of Delacroix's was made for demonstration, because there's no way he'd take out that many pigments. I mean, maybe at the beginning of the day to work, but it depends on how much paint. The paint can develop skin. It depends on how the paint is stored. At the end of every day, I tend to make small quantities. And at the end of every day, I prefer to make them again. But there's also a theory where you make them far in advance, you know, in effect sort of marinating them almost. And then you use them as you go. Okay, then I brought in 3 different types of yellows. This is the arsenic one, and this one is Naples yellow. This particular batch, one thing that I like about the company is they tell you exactly where it's from. And this one is from Paris. And Naples yellow is no longer allowed in the United States. It's lead-based. And you see a lot of substitutes. And then I brought in one of the modern substitutes, Bristol yellow. This is nothing like the other 2. But, you know, it can be, you can find shades that are closer than, that's arsenic. And if you see, it has like a little skeleton on, a little skull on the side to warn you.
Okay, let me just...
The oil have for you though, because the oil must be different. It can't always be the same, and therefore that must also impact pigment.
The oils for me have been problematic. And in fact, you know, I was going to say it at the end, but as long as it comes up now, I don't use exclusively pigments. I had an experience which shook me because I did a series of paintings that had a white background on them, and I used titanium white mixed with a very sort of syrupy, wonderful oil called oleum crasum that was from sun-dried in Italy. And I picked, I showed the work, and I sold some, and I had one left over, and I pulled it out, and this was like a giant oyster, a 6-foot oyster. And the back had silk screening the definition of oyster on it from the Oxford English Dictionary, which was almost sort of like a random definition when you extract, especially the latter part where they have quotes from things. And it had turned yellow. And I called the company in a panic. And I said, and they said, well, put the painting in the sun for about 3 months. So I did, and it got better. But I thought, you know what, forget it. I don't want to, and then I called various people who had, I tracked the people down who got it, because it wasn't just a simple thing which you could redo with another white. And I don't varnish my stuff. And you couldn't just redo it because it had the silkscreen writing on top of the white. So after that, I began looking for substitutes, particularly with white, and I found Block's paint. Block's is B-L-O-C-X-X, and it's a tiny Belgian company. And Block's paint makes all of their pale colors with poppy seed oil. Poppy seed takes forever to dry, but it's a totally clear oil that never yellows. And it's worth, so, I started to use where I could find substitutes for the pigments that I considered to be no loss in quality. I started to use them because the pigments also take a very, very long time to dry. This is the sepia, and am I allowed to open this if we do? Okay. So really sniff it. Put your nose in here. And it definitely smells like the sea.
So do we know what oils Delacroix may have used? Because, I mean, Turner had such terrible problems. Turners are all damaged and they will deteriorate because they use such poor oils. But do we know what oils Delacroix would have used?
Well, I'll tell you that the identification of paint media is a more recent thing. People traditionally have been able to more easily identify pigment particles. So I would say that, you know, stay tuned. I'd say it's probably, you know, depending on if there's an exhibition, another exhibition on Delacroix. I mean, this is the type of thing that spurs investigations. Typically, someone doesn't just, let's identify, you know.
Looking at the pictures that have not been, you know, damaged by conservation, poor conservation, it looks as though he used really good quality, both pigments and oil.
Well, I think that it's a curious question because I think, you know, what Abby's bringing up is something, a question that we need to consider, in that, you know, I've gotten this thing from here, and I've gotten this thing from here, and I've gotten this thing from here, and I've got ultramarine that looks like this, and ultramarine that looks like this, and, you know, so there are different processes that are involved to get a certain color, you might say. For ultramarine, for instance, the longer you grind ultramarine, the grayer it gets. On the other hand, if you want this brilliant blue with the ultramarine, it's going to be very granular. So there are all of these issues, and one can imagine in the early to mid 19th century, when all these new products were just coming into the market, the great variation that you would find. And again, it's something that I've mentioned and Claire mentioned, you know, one can imagine the darkening because of these resins, and who knows what kind of resin was used, that has occurred since Delacroix initially put his brush to his support.
But just to be clear, in terms of conservation practice, of course, you never try and replicate the actual pigments. You're always using water-soluble, removable. Right.
Right. Well, so what we do, again, you know, we don't use oils, obviously. You know, we use something that's synthetic and stable, that won't discolor.
But that's completely removable.
And that's reversible, right?
What's the pigment in that very vivid green that you see in Delacroix? What is that pigment? It's so unique.
I don't know, it might be a mixture.
Yeah.
Chrome green and
painted at that time, that kind of electric green color.
teal.
It might be chrome. I mean, chrome was a pigment, chrome green was a pigment that was introduced, as I was saying, in the 1830s.
And some of his, his palettes have been analyzed. I mean, as
Right.
you showed today.
Right.
Eric.
I have actually, there's
Try
an
the list
analysis
of greens
of
on
that
the
palette. But the thing is, it was done with, as I was saying, with XRF, which is X-ray fluorescence. And what that does is it tells us what elements, so here's the palette, what elements are found in each of the pigments. And I kind of wrote down quickly when I looked at the report at the Baltimore Museum of Art. So for instance, here's this pinkish color. It says zinc, lead, iron, and cadmium. The next step would be to figure out what pigments have those elements in it. And that step hasn't been done. But again, you know, I was mentioning a number of times the darkening of some of these. So for instance, here you see, you know, a third of this palette is dark. But I think because of your question is the resin. I think the resin has a great deal to do with the darkening of these colors.
Right. Because some of them, I mean, vermilion is an example which is, you know, really does maintain its colour if it's good quality vermilion. Presumably, but it's more difficult to get. Can you still use vermilion today? I mean, can you get it? It's but it's made from mercury, so whether it's made in
Well, that's why she's plugging this German chemist.
That would think that.
Isn't vermilion made from mercury? It's poison, basically.
Yes, it is. Vermilion is definitely made, you know, it's a...
But is it sold here now? Can you still buy it?
Yeah, absolutely.
It hasn't been banned yet.
Yes, you can. You can. I think. I shouldn't say that, but I think you can.
Last time I checked, you could.
Yeah, that's what I think. Okay, and then I just brought an assortment. I brought also an assortment of earths because from different places to just reinforce how different how much variability with it they are. I see actually this one. Wait, two of them aren't exactly earths. So let me pass. Okay, so this is an earth from France in pale green. This one, which is sort of gray, is known as Bohemian green. This one is Bavarian earth green. This one is green earth from Germany. And there is a very bluish one. Oh, this one is green earth from Cyprus. And this one is A green, natural green earth. Does not say where it's from. It's sort of surprising that it doesn't say where it's from, and I also brought in, for the same reason, except that I didn't ship a big enough quantity, so the difference will not be as marked as it would have been had I brought in bigger jars. But two pigments that look relatively similar to one another. They have radically different weights. Some pigments are as fine as like talcum powder. And especially like a lot of the Japanese glass pigments, they weigh nothing. And they feel like talcum powder. And some of the pigments are much, much heavier. This one is zinc dust. The heaviest pigment is pewter dust, but I didn't bring it because I thought that these two, the colors are so close that it was more interesting to see two that were. And so, you know, the weight of the pigment is going to affect the way it sits on the canvas. And there are all these many, many things to consider. And then this is the grinder. And I see that it's dirty from my studio. I cleaned it off, but you can see residue of paint on the sides from it. And so, as I said, sometimes I don't want to misrepresent myself and say that I only work with pigments. I'm fascinated by the pigments. And I love to sort of, I also love the process of making paint because you start out with powder. You make like a little mountain of pigment. Make a hole in it the way you would like if you were making a volcano out of sand or something. And pour the oil in and grind it. And you watch it become paint. And it's sort of astounding and miraculous. And I find that there's a lot of, in the paints that you make yourself, they're sort of more sensual to use than something that you just pour out. And very often, what is sold in a tube as, say, Naples yellow, it's nothing like what actually is Naples yellow, but that's okay if you know what's inside the tube when you buy it. But I find that it's just making the paints and having the pigments around is I think it's more for pleasure at this point, that there's such a sensuality in working with them. They also take much longer to dry, so you kind of have to be aware of that. And
well, to go back to your old friend Liquin, one of the reasons that became so widely used, or its attraction, was that it supposedly offered the exact, you know, it replicated linseed oil, but it dried way faster, so you could start working in, you know, within an hour, But of course, as you discovered, it's none of these synthetic
Well,
facsimiles.
you know, I mean, there are mediums that can hasten the drying, but the acrylics, when I started to use, for example, like acrylics, and they were dry before I was done with them, that was like impossible, because I like to. And then also now, which really wasn't done in Delacroix's time, but now there are lots of painters who work wet into wet deliberately, and you know, who love working wet into wet. But the fact that the acrylics became dry before you had finished covering the canvas, that one part, the part that you started with, could be dry, and it was like not something. Is that what you asked? I'm having trouble with the echo. I didn't quite.
Oh yeah, exactly. That's one of, like, the temporality of paint. Oil painting itself is a hugely instrumental factor in this. The drying times, and just to get, like, you do want to have a stickiness, a tackiness, but you don't want it to be kind of, you don't want your pigments to muddy. And,
yes.
And I'm just thinking, for example, Robert Herbert wrote a very important article in 1979 on the drying times of Monet's late canvases, and you know, it kind of really revolutionized, I think. Well, certainly when I read it, I completely gave up my idea of what I had thought Monet was, because he had the whole thing figured out, and he would wait for days, you know, if needs be. So just to, you know, and it's just because you're talking about poppy seed oil in particular,
right,
and that, you know, demands the kind of the patient tick, tick, tick tock of the clock. As
definitely, definitely. On the other hand, you know, so that you try, or I like to try as a painter, to have, you know, to take care and to know the materials. And I do understand Delacroix using gelatin from the butcher. He shouldn't have, but it's like, you know, you hear people, oh, I paint with car paint, and I put car paint on, you know, I mean, and I like to try to anticipate problems, but, and that's why I was so mortified when the painting turned yellow, because I really had considered myself to have researched it, but it is what it is. I don't know whether anyone has.
Have you used tempera at all? Have you ever used tempera?
I did. You know, I love tempera. I think it's just amazing. But the thing is, you have to plan out the whole painting before. And I don't really work like that. You know, to have to figure out what you want, to have to literally know exactly how you want the painting to look at the end is problematic for me. I mean, I love looking at tempera. And that's also fascinating. I mean, egg tempera. Because some people say, oh, I work with tempera, and they don't. They work with acrylics. You know, but they will say that they work only in tempera, and they don't. And so, but when you actually, the methodology of working in tempera, I think it just requires a different personality, it's such a different set of work habits that it didn't, much as I admired the result, I didn't think it was for me.
The pigments remain more stable. Usually.
Yes, they do.
I mean, that's their advantage, I suppose, you know.
Oh, it's a huge advantage. It's a huge advantage. See, I think that if you, I believe in trying to find the best products that you possibly can when you work. And that in this, a lot of people have much more adventurous approaches to their painting. And they'll do, you know, but I try to figure out what the consequences might be of what I do.
What is interesting is, if you look at painting at the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century, you see a stark shift in the stability of the colours. And presumably that's the oil, I mean, that they're using,
sure.
because, you know, and it is quite dramatic. Suddenly you get Caravaggio's colours are very stable and strong, and yet just 20 years earlier you have, you know, serious problems with paintings in Milan at the end of the 16th century. Presumably that's the oil, but I just don't know what they did, you know.
Well, I think a lot of the times, I think it probably is oil. And that some of the linseeds, you know, like, that's why I started to use blocks paint, because all of the light colors are made with poppy seed oil, all of them. And it's basically the light, I mean, dark colors, like the blackening that the Delacroix experience, exists sometimes. Like you have the Ashcan school where everything sort of turned black. But mostly it's that the light color's yellow. And so when you add linseed to it, it's going to yellow.
But there's the other factor which is that some pigments, when they're used unmixed in oil, which you probably know, like azurite, will darken and turn black, which is why we see so many black veils in Italian painting. And so sometimes, and I think I've noticed with the copper greens, which can turn brown, that's, I think, more likely to occur when they're used in a pure form. But sometimes I think when white is mixed, it's kind of it stabilizes the color a little bit. So that's another factor to consider. And we know that smalt, which was kind of a cheaper, it was like a cheaper substitute for lapis.
Right.
It was cool, like the tonality is similar to lapis, but it was a much cheaper substitute. It will turn a kind of a gray-brown in oil. So, you know, it's partly the oil, but it's partly a pigment used. Certain pigments are unstable when they're used in their pure form in oil.
And actually, like there are coppers that on the website where it says not for use in oil, for tempera only. And so, you know, I mean, I try to, obviously you have to be aware of it. You have to, like, know what you're doing, and sometimes you don't until it's too late. But that's...
I was just wondering from your point of view, because this is one of those, I don't know, truisms of Impressionism, right? And then I'm sitting here looking at the academic tradition slowly dying in the corner over here, Impressionism blossoming on this side. But, you know, we always talk about the temporality, the process, the rapidity of the application of paint that we assume is part of the Impressionist mark. Not to sound too much like Richard Schiff, but when you look at a painting like the Bouguereau or the Rapine, do you sense the slowness of the process? Because from what you're saying and from what I understand about the pigments that were being used in a more academic sense, it all does just take a lot longer, right? So there's a whole lot of calculation that is going into every square inch of the painting. But is it actually true to say, as some have contended, that the Impressionist mark is always a rapid one?
Well, I think that it is, but it doesn't mean it's all at one time. I mean, I think that you can see that that is much more gradual, much more considered in the building up, and that I think what was so revolutionary about Delacroix was that he brought that spontaneity of touch that the Impressionists took in a much, like, for example, and that hadn't been seen before. I think, like, didn't Monet, when he was painting his haystacks, he used to work on quite a few at once.
Right.
And so he'd work on the 10 a.m. ones, and then he'd switch to the 12 noon ones as the day went on. And so it may be rapid, but maybe not necessarily in one session.
Well, the French artists were better trained technically. This is one thing, whether they're painting Impressionists or whether they're painting more academic paintings. They were simply better trained in chemistry of paint than, say, British artists were, who, you know, you see Reynolds using pigments that have completely gone because they just weren't properly trained in the English tradition. Whereas these French artists, whether it's, I mean, Monet was trained by deeply, he spent some time in an academician's studio, learning all those techniques, which exactly the same way that Jerome learned them.
I actually have to disagree, because I think that Monet spent some time in the Académie Julienne,
With
having gone from Le
Blair,
Havre.
he was a student of Blair.
But wasn't that a very short period? I don't think he would have absorbed that much technical.
Isn't it in their sort of DNA of their training, the old French tradition? I mean, we just don't see the condition problems with.
Well, I totally agree with you. On that. That's the proof is in the pudding. Yes, indeed, in the condition of the canvases.
We see in English painting, we see it's completely different. You know, we see problems that don't exist in French painting.
But I think it's also the temperament of the artists themselves. I mean, Monet was someone that's turned out, we can see in retrospect now looking at the paintings, he was deeply interested in the quality and the stability and the endurance of his pictures. But you know, you have other artists that knew they were having problems with even how they were mixing the ground, for example, like Gauguin, you know, knew that he was using poor quality pigments with a crumbly ground that wasn't adhering to the canvas. And in his lifetime, these things were falling apart, and he didn't care.
He wasn't properly trained either.
No, he wasn't, but I don't think he's so dissimilar from a lot of artists working at that time too. So I think some of them really cared about that longevity and their reputation, whereas others were, you know, kind of to some degree, I think they were still thinking about the big picture, but more the here and now, and just someone else's problem. Someone else will have to fix it. But this is the effect I want right now, and you know, that's it. So I mean, I agree with what you're saying in terms of maybe more of a tradition and knowledge. You know, in France, but at the same time, I think, you know, by the time at the end of the 19th century, they were well aware with some of the pigment fading, for example. Van Gogh knew he was using reds that were fading. He still chose to use them. So I mean, it gets more complicated.
I think sometimes, you know, a painter may say, particularly like Gauguin, who's obviously a sort of difficult personality, they may say they don't care, but it's their way of bluffing, and what do I care? You know, I mean, it's just, there'll be no way of knowing how much they care or don't. If they can't solve it, then they don't want to deal with it, especially at a stage in their career, you know, where there's bluffing that goes on, I think, from anyone. You won't hear anyone say, well, I used much too cheap an oil here, and that's why it was my own fault. They always say, you know, little did I know when I bought the most expensive, finest oil that I could find that it would turn brown within 10 minutes, you know, or whatever.
What was also saying, which was interesting, was it's somebody else's problem. Like I want my immortality. I'm bluffing in that sense, because as you say exactly, and I agree with you, it has the ring of authentic truth. You're talking in, you're the studio person. But there's a kind of an acquiescence to other people, or, you know, they'll take care of it, they'll like patch up, you know, Claire is going to magically appear in a Superwoman shirt. So,
well, I had a problem. It was interesting when you said artists should never restore their work, because I had a problem with something that tore when I dropped it from the easel, my fault entirely. And I called my friend who's a conservator. I called Michelle Marancola at the Institute of Fine Arts. And I said, help, what do I do? Can you fix it for me? And she said, I can, but the painting will be a lot more valuable if you fix it yourself, doing what I tell you. And I said, okay, tell me what to do. So that was like...
That's interesting.
That
surprises me.
What?
That surprises me.
Yeah, she said, let me tell you what to do, and you do it. Because then it's the way, if you do it, then there's no intervention.
Well, that happened with Ari Scheffer, because actually in 1851, his Paolo and Francesca, which is now in the Wallace collection, had been sold in the Orleans sale, and it had used bitumen, and it had already started to deteriorate. And the buyer, who is Prince Demidov, sent it back to Ari Scheffer to try and redo, and actually he struggled with it, and it looks a terrible mess today. So he actually completely redid the whole composition again, all over again. But there's an example, presumably Fritz Demidoff, who'd paid a record price at auction for a contemporary work of art, decided that he needed the artist to do the restoration. Actually, he was incompetent, but proof in the pudding.
What was that experience like for you, restoring your own painting? I mean, did you enjoy that?
No. I was annoyed at myself because my own carelessness and that it fell off the easel. I mean, paintings don't fall off easels. And so I was annoyed at myself, but it wasn't, I was too far along in the painting to abandon it, and I liked what I'd done. And then I thought, well, come on, I can patch this up. And also don't forget that I'm not Picasso here. So if I, would that my paintings will remain more valuable because it was I who restored them. But, I mean, I think who was it who put their knee through, So, but I felt like this was my own fault, and it was sheer absent-mindedness on my part. So it was not a pleasure.
And was the result good? That you were happy with the result?
No, it was perfect.
That's great.
It was perfect. I just put, no. But what I did was, what she said to do was to use the same type of canvas to make a little patch on the back, which I glued on, of the identical type of canvas, and to glue it on with archival, glue. And then I painted over that area, that section a lot, so that you hardly saw it once it was. I think what happened was it fell off the easel and then banged into another painting on the floor. So, the corner of one painting went into the other, but it was fine. It was fine.
Well, on that cheerful note, I don't know if we have the energy left to continue any longer. I mean, we can, you obviously can go back into the galleries and look. We're open for another half an hour. But I don't know what to say. I feel like I can't live without you now. So, but I do want to thank you all for participating. I hope you got something out of these 2 days. I know I certainly did, and we will post the videos so you can see your charming selves all over again if you'd really like to. But really, thank you very, very much for coming, and I really hope you enjoy the catalog. Feel free to write to me personally and disagree with whatever you want to disagree with. And yes, I hope to see you all very soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. You want a drink?